Okay. And well, welcome everyone to Friday afternoon at the Manor. We're in for a wonderful treat today. As people are plugging in, we've made history. We now have the next phase of our Friday afternoon series program developing as we have sent out. The 21st century has arrived at Manor Road, and we've gone light speed factor 4. One of our members is now online. We are celebrating this. Welcome, Carolyn, to our wonderful viewing platform. And now I pass our microphone over to Susan Johnson, who will bring greetings.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. And welcome today. Our speaker is Dr. Julia Rady Shaw, a local historian who is going to tell us about history of Protestant churches in Toronto in the post-Second World War. So, Doctor?
Hello,
Welcome.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia, and I have, since I was little, loved history. I love the stories that we share about our past, and I have carried this love with me throughout my schooling, and then more schooling, and then more schooling. 3 years ago, I graduated from the University of Toronto with my PhD in history. And my dissertation looked at that really interesting period of time between 1945 and 1956-ish. Because in history, we don't love hard timelines, even if we love to memorize dates. And I really was interested in what happened in Ontario as a society transitioned from World War to Cold War. I particularly looked at the main Protestant churches, the United Church, the Presbyterians, and the Anglicans, because based on census data and polling data, the Gallup poll, for example, a great many Ontarians still identified as being Christian as one of these churches and belonging to one of these churches. And I asked myself, how did religion change in this decade when so much had already happened in society? You know, from 1929, when you have the Great Depression, and then you're right into a Second World War, and then you immediately got catapulted into the Cold War. It's a tremendous period of time of upheaval. And I wanted to know, well, how did religion change? A popular story about religion in it is of its long decline or secularization that accelerated especially after the Great Depression. The story goes that the modern world was incompatible with traditional religion, that church and state were separate in the 20th century by virtue of the modern political state and the nation state apparatus, and that the pace of life accelerated after industrialization around 1900, and this put organized religion on notice, if you will. So I think there's certainly a large amount of evidence to support this interpretation of our past. The church certainly did not hold the same primary role in a person's life as it once did. Just prior to this meeting, we were talking about how Ontario was mapped in the 19th century, you know, as we started to settle it, in the township system. And the township system, in that lovely, very regimented, very British gridded pattern, always had a church at the crossroads. This, of course, is not happening in and around 1950. So society is reorganizing itself. But, and there's always a but, when you start to look a little bit more closely at the politics of the period and society around 1945, religion still seems to be very present and very influential. It still organized how people commemorated both the Great War and more recently the Second World War. In fact, our great national cenotaph wasn't unveiled until 1939 on the eve of the Second World War. It's present in the way that Canadian war bonds were sold during the Second World War, and it was done through the churches. Religious institutions helped tremendously in the war effort on the home front. The mobilization of women's groups and war work is a topic in and of itself that's truly tremendous. So I began to wonder if maybe instead of asking why religion declined after 1945, we need to ask a whole different question. Maybe we should ask how people's relationship with religion and their church changed. Because by asking how, it lets us, explore the processes at work. We can dig a little bit deeper. We can see the processes at work in society and have a better sense of maybe what's going on and get a sense of the nuances. One of the challenges of talking about religion or researching religion is that we can't truly know the hearts and minds of people. You can't say, oh, so and so believed this, because there's just no evidence of what they're thinking, even though we might have minutes of meetings or journals, etc. It's no strict rules for it. But we can guess and we can theorize actually quite well. And we can do this by looking at not just one sort of body of source material where, historians make their bread and butter, but we can look at popular literature and popular culture. We can look at politics and try and fuse and tug on all of these threads to craft a new story. So it's a big topic, this title of my talk today. So I thought that with my introduction done, I would touch upon some of the ways that we can understand this post-war Protestant change and try to get at how a person or a person's or a society's relationship with religion and the church changed. It's not a story of decline, but instead it's a story of reorientation. Things just shifted, and that's sort of where the interesting bit is. It's a story of diffusion. I'm not a theory-heavy historian. I do not love isms and ologies, although they have their place. That said, I like other really smart people who have really good ideas that maybe we haven't looked at in Canada. And one of the ideas that I came across over my studies and that I still think is important is this idea of diffusive Christianity. And it's an idea that was born in post-war Britain, and there's still lots of connections between Britain and Canada. And diffusive Christianity also comes with a snappy soundbite. It's believing without belonging. And I would add it was belonging without believing. It's the notion that religious beliefs and fervor is not so concentrated in one place, so in the church, but instead it sort of lofts out and moves out into society in very different ways. And things get a lot more tangled and bound up. So what you would think as, a religious symbol is embedded under other layers of ideas and secular symbols as well. Mother's Day being an example in Canada. Mothering Sunday began in Britain as a way to return to your home church and to return to family. And early in the 20th century in Canada, instead, it got lauded as a way to celebrate our mothers and become a card holiday. So often sort of the origin story might be religious, but over time it changes. And that's sort of what I was looking at after 1945. So there's no big characters in the story I'm going to tell you today, apart from sort of the churches themselves, but I still think it's an interesting story. And I think a really interesting way to talk about sort of diffusion of Christianity that I think is happening after 1945 is to take to the airwaves. Marshall McLuhan, our famous Canadian media guy, said that radio affects most people intimately, person to person, offering a world of unspoken communication between writer, speaker, and listener. That is the immediate aspect of radio. In Canada, radio began early in the 20th century when we started to have those technologies, and it really took off after 1922. By 1932, Canada had over 60 stations. In 1936, the CBC, as we know it, was formed. And there was a special commission, the Aird Commission in 1929, that looked at programming in Canada and decided as a result of this commission that everybody should have access to it and the content of which should be left up. So the church too got in on radio. All of the Protestant churches, this was an amazing new medium to be a part of. And there was tremendous possibility. But how do you convey that? And like with a lot of things, there's a lot of policy and a lot of oversight to prevent bickering and to keep controversy at a minimum. So the same is true for religion and the radio. So there was a National Religious Advisory Committee or a board that was struck to govern the church time on the air, because they didn't want abuse by any one group to make it, they wanted everybody to play well with others. So over the course of the 30s and especially after 1945, the churches sort of saw this as a potential for the new world. In all of the minutes of the Anglicans and the Presbyterians in the United Church, there's mention at the synod level, at the oversight level, that we need to get on board with technology. I'm paraphrasing. Otherwise, we risk losing a tremendous audience. You know, we need to get into the modern world. So there's a recognition that things are changing, but how do we as a church body change with it? So the churches had courted a broader congregation through radio since the beginning. Faith-based programming comprised a way to reach beyond the pews and potentially to reach individuals who had not gone to church for some time. Apart from religious hours on Sunday, the churches mounted an increasingly vibrant program of religious-themed broadcasting. In the post-war decade, radio became all the more important to churches because it was a mechanism of modernization. It was a way to stay current. It became a venue in which religion remained relevant, revelatory, and it connected a large group of people, even if they couldn't be all together. Does it sound a little bit familiar with what we're experiencing today? Radio did not become a proxy for a church or it's a church service. Instead, it became an extension of almost an evangelical program where the hope was maybe we can get somebody back into the fold because we're connecting with them through a different mouthpiece. Some historians might interpret the push for broadcasting as a response to the mounting forces of secularization, right? If religion is in decline, we need to do everything we can possibly to combat it. And this is absolutely true, but I don't think, as I say, this is the full story. Radio did offer an avenue for churches to remain relevant and adapt, but the changes, I think, are a little bit more nuanced. So the CBC, our National Public Radio System, offers all of our lots of denominations, the Roman Catholics, the Anglicans, the Baptists, all of them, time on the radio. By 1949, there are 6 dedicated religious programs on the CBC alone. So the idea was that they could harness this technological advancement for peaceful purposes. These 6 religious broadcasts aired on the CBC, and they took on a range of interests and approaches. It wasn't just sermonizing through the radio. They tried to tap into other interests. The Way of the Spirit was one program, and it was developed by the Anglican Church and conveyed Christ's teachings through a series of audio plays. The Catholic Church offered Religious Period, a program that invited a speaker to deal with topical issues. Additionally, this show ran a series of 10 broadcasts leading up to Christmas to try and make Christmas more about Christ as opposed to Santa Claus. As an expression of interfaith dialogue and in order to provide a balance amongst the main denominations, the Church of the Air was created, and it aired on a weekly basis and rotated between the Presbyterians, the United Church, and the Anglicans to provide its content. Each morning, the CBC offered morning devotions for 15 minutes. Similar to the Church of the Air, this program featured a variety of denominational speakers who had been chosen and organized by this National Religious Advisory Committee, trying to keep everything fair. And then finally, there was the World Church News, and it had a weekly broadcast. And here it was Dr. the Reverend Dr. William J. Gallagher of the United Church, who goes on to help form what became the Canadian Council of Churches. But he provided news with respect to the Christian church on the international stage. So we see things from a local perspective, from a denominational perspective, from literature trying to show plays, and then trying to connect the local church with what's going on the international stage. So it might seem from all of this, sharing of programming time on the CBC that everybody got along. But no, the world of church radio was cutthroat. It was very challenging. Everybody wanted to have primacy of voice because it connected to their mission. And they went out to try and find interesting people to talk about. They would issue pamphlets, for example. The United Church issued a pamphlet to its London, Ontario conference called Voice of the Church Through Radio. And it was meant for distribution amongst the local churches in that southwestern Ontario area, which named all of the local ministers who took to the airwaves to try and get people to listen to the program and to get private stations to carry these shows, because I've talked about 6 programs that were on our public, like our national broadcast system, but there are lots more private radio stations. So there's still this business model to contend with and how you have to remain relevant. Ministers across the province and denominations, they wanted their church to be the dial destination. So, and in part because I think this medium allows the church to spread their evangelical message further afield. And it caused a lot of them to wonder, well, how do we do this? This is something new that we're grappling with. The Anglicans wondered in one of their, their early sort of minutes and conversations about whether shorter programs were more likely to catch the ear of people, or whether Canadian churches ought to model themselves off the British with more hour-long programs that listeners could anticipate on a weekly level. Nobody was quite sure what exactly to do with it. They all just knew that something needed to happen. And it never really got fully resolved, because often things will go to a meeting and then you put it over for discussion, and then it gets put over for discussion again. So a lot of the programming ends up being a little bit more ad hoc, but I think the message still gets across. And as I said, they had to be careful, because they had this lovely overlord, or the advisory committee, that made sure that everybody played nicely with one another. And it was a highly competitive market. You could be religious, but not too religious. You could talk about doctrinal issues, but not so much that it could step on the toes of other denominations. The United Churches Committee on Radio Broadcasting discussed the place of radio evangelism in the changing landscape of Canadian Christianity. Its chair, the chair of this committee, Albert Buchanan, moved that whereas the main roots of the troubles of our world today are the multitudes outside the Christian church who do not practice the teachings of our Christian faith, and the nominal Christians to whom the basic teachings of Christ and his church mean little or nothing in practice. So it was trying to find a message that would reach the people who believed fervently and those who didn't want it to dismiss out of hand.
Safe driving mode. What the hell?
No, don't talk.
You got it. I did it the other way and it came back.
Let me fix it. Oh dear.
The other way to look at it, though, so you're trying to reach a large audience, but could you dilute your message so much that the essence of your church, what makes Presbyterians Presbyterians and Anglicans Anglicans and Catholics Catholics, does that get too diluted as you try to compete on this stage? So, if you could diffuse the message, but you risk dilution and the absence of fellowship. So there was a really delicate balancing act with respect to sort of radio. So it's both extremely exciting, but it causes a lot of people to talk and discuss about how this message can reach a larger audience. And I think certainly because of advisory boards boards and content laws, and censorship to a certain extent, that the message does become a lot more diffuse, that you have your radio hours talking a lot more high level than, say, nitty gritties that you would get in a Sunday service. I think an exception would be the Baptists. They had a huge oratorical presence, and that brought people together. And they had a large influence coming up from the United States. So it adds yet another element to this competitive market, because the United Church is not, they can't compete with the light of, Fulton Sheen or a Manning from Alberta. They need to maintain sort of a sense of their own doctrinal importance and denomination. So the more mainstream, diffusive sort of Christianity developed on the air as a result of these regulations. So it becomes diluted or diffused across, and the softening of doctrinal messages in order to maintain sort of a Christian presence on the radio, because you didn't want to get kicked off, sort of allowed religion to permeate quite widely, but at sort of a soft focus level. I think, as I noted, there's a bit of a really interesting parallel to our current times as we seek out new ways to connect with one another. And I think it helps to reinforce this point. We want to all be together, but apart, to see each other's faces without masks. And you have to try and turn to other technological advancements to help do so. Radio, as it was in the mid-20th century, might not be the same today. We certainly don't have the same religious hours. There might be dedicated religious stations, and that's a result of later 20th century changes in broadcasting. But we have Zoom, and we have podcasts, and we have technology that engages our auditory senses in a similar way, that for some, it can remain very anonymous, that you can belong or participate, but you can do so at your own independence and by your own choice. You can turn off your camera. And for others, it means more full engagement in the life of sort of the church or in society. So we can believe without belonging, or belong without necessarily believing. Religion on the airwaves, we've noted, was political in its own way, and it forced a thinking about where churches as institutions could go in this post-war decade. And I think it's a very overt example of the way that religion remains very present in society, that it's not necessarily in decline, but it's being reoriented, right? There's a new perspective. It's finding new ways to sort of exist in society. I think there's another more embedded example that we can turn to, and it's also quite political. And it's how people conceived of their citizenship in Canada. How do you define being a Canadian in this post-war decade? There's a lovely glossy pamphlet that gets released by the government at the time as they're trying to explore the possibilities of what if. You have C.D. Howe in the Canadian government, the minister of everything, mobilizing the wartime industries now into post-war industries, and the economy is trucking along. So it's a time where I think everybody thinks that this is a moment that we can seize, and they're not, again, much like with the radio, they're not quite sure how to do so. So in this pamphlet, it says that the story of Canada's post-war possibilities is one to challenge the imagination. And it's these pamphlets that are released by the government and by groups, they're optimistic. And the government issued ones certainly want to explore the opportunities that are available, and they get, handed out at, government centers, et cetera. It was an exciting time after 1945, and it was a challenging time. And I think the very possibilities that sparked imagination were tempered by the reality of what could be achieved. So again, to turn back to the example, we're very excited about radio, but it's tempered by the reality of getting along with other denominations by what is possible, by what our membership is willing to put forward as our message. How far can we push the envelope? And I think that this also happened when it came to trying to define what did it mean to be a good citizen after 1945. And I think I'm going to touch especially upon education, because by this point in time, remember, church and state, they're separate. We shouldn't have, such religiosity in our schools. Oh, no. That is not what was declared in Ontario. Between 1945 and 1950, we had another one of those lovely royal commissions that Canada likes to do. And this one was to particularly explore the role of education for children in Ontario. It included a copious number of town hall meetings, liaising with special interest groups, which included church groups and the Girl Guides and local schools and teachers' colleges and town halls that just brought in people. And it is a very thick book. It was shelved in 1950 by the premier at the time, Leslie Frost, because he just didn't want to deal with it, in my opinion. But I think it's still a really interesting report in that it's 5 years of some very smart people thinking about what people have told them about education, about what they want their society to be like. And so in a way, it's able to distill what's in the hearts and minds of people in a very public document. The Hope Report identified 2 virtues above any other that they wanted, or 2 virtues that reflected the intellectual and religious heritage of Western civilization: honesty and Christian love. So when educators and politicians adjudicated why they needed this royal commission, the preservation of Western civilization frequently received a great deal of attention. This is perhaps not terribly surprising. As I mentioned at the onset, we might have ended the war in 1945, but we very quickly entered the Cold War. It was within, a few months that Igor Guzhenko, the man without a face, defected as a Soviet spy to Canada, which ignited the idea that there was a red threat in Canada, which had always been simmering, but became a lot more potent in this post-war period. So the idea that you needed to protect Western civilization received a lot of attention. And the virtues that were associated with Western civilization and its system of government required protection: honesty and Christian love were the 2 virtues that the report authors deemed necessary for the preservation and operation of democracy, as well as to safeguard this democracy from false doctrines which threatened to overthrow it. Clearly, the false doctrine is that of communism at this point in time. The Hope Report reflected more than just an earnest desire to review the education system. The larger context within which it was written and framed reveals a lot of anxieties that society was grappling with at this time, from the one war to another. So why such talk about the preservation of democracy? Well, as I've noted, it's not just that it went from World War to Cold War with no breathing room. It's that they're dealing with still a lot of lingering strife. The cessation of hostilities of the Second World War might have been in 1945, but that did not necessarily end the war for a lot of people. Demobilization occurred slowly. Rationing remained in effect for quite some time afterwards. There was a lot of rebuilding, more so in Europe than in Canada, but as people waited for it to come home, some people who didn't come home, so you're dealing with the lingering trauma of that. And citizens felt harrowed, I think, after nearly 2 decades of strife, because this didn't just begin with the Second World War, it began with the Great Depression in 1929 that led to a decade of hunger and unemployment and worry. and then into a world war that caused tremendous upheaval, and now into a Cold War, which is sort of an existential crisis. It was relentless. Some would argue like COVID, but I think it was in a far more acute way at this time. But if anything we can learn from our present situation is that if this pandemic has taken a toll on our own mental health, what must it have been like for those who for year upon decade had to pivot and shift and be uncertain about the future. So again, I think it's not unsurprising that, to return to the Hope Report and the way that people are thinking about society, that they're looking at these types of issues and framing them in a very large context. Society had been tested over and over again. And this scourge of communism that you're not quite sure how it's going to look like, this loomed very large. So where do? We turn to our children, because like Whitney Houston said, the children are our future. The school system could not be charged with this momentous undertaking alone. So that in the school system, to create good citizens that will grow up to make good life choices and to help cement this bedrock of Western civilization. It's one thing to teach children, but it had to be done in concert with other institutions. So the authors of the Hope Report called upon the home to provide them security necessary for the flourishing of their students. And they also called upon the church to strengthen its spiritual foundations. So these three institutions, home, school, and church, were the means to a brighter future. It was in the cooperation of these three institutions that society could combat any external threat, ideological or otherwise. The emphasis placed by the authors of the report and society more broadly on the power of these three institutions, I think it represented an impulse to preserve normality, or what they conceived of what was normal at the time, because I think that was constantly shifting. And I think you sort of think back to a brighter past. And in the case of this generation, it was a path that was rooted into Sundays, attending church, and where there was a strong home life and kids went to school and you would grow up and you would get married, and then rinse and repeat. So these norms were sustained through a connection with values, shared values and traditions that they felt carried over from the pre-war period. And I think that it was the church and the consistency of the church's messaging about these values that helped to carry it through. So in this case, it's not a church in decline. It's a church as one of the only barometers of consistency that connects sort of this pre-crisis point to this post-crisis point, even if it was a bit of a rocky road to get there. So in a society where church and state ought to be separate, this Hope Report, a public and government document about a public institution, it's an amazing historical document that shows us how people conceived of citizenship with a particularly religious or Christian framework. And I think to revisit these ideas, we can also see how some of the systems of injustice in Canada, particularly towards Indigenous groups, derive from an entrenched worldview within this period that perceived a threat in anything other than the dominant mainstream white religion, because it's becoming entrenched in our political documents. And unfortunately, I think that intermingling, because it's not sort of at the level of we're talking about it every day on the street, but it's becoming sort of these bedrock documents, it perpetuates that the marginalization of marginal groups and other injustices that are exacted upon those who are other. We can turn to Canada's immigration legacy in this period, as well as other evidence. So I could drone on for any number of other examples. but I think it's an appropriate time to sort of shift away, and talk maybe about one last little thing, and then we can open things up to questions. And that's sort of the commemoration of the wars. As I think I mentioned at the beginning, the First World War's commemoration was about cenotaphs. There were big memorials. They occupied these giant cement edifices, occupying prominent locations in the city, and they were inscribed with um, beautiful inscriptions about the glorious dead. And there was certainly a very strong Christian influence in all of these. After the Second World War, they're tired, and it doesn't happen this way. After the Second World War, we get recreational centers. So for example, our very own Leaside Community Center was constructed out of the economics of transferring from a wartime industry to a non-wartime industry. So it employed people who needed jobs, but the idea was to create a space where people could go and reflect upon their citizenship, to become better citizens. It was a place where we could send our youth, because clearly we're very concerned about them. We've offered this huge, really big, thick book about education, to prevent them from immoral trappings of communism or delinquency. Let's give them a space to go and run around, and they can exercise. And in that exercise, they will become better citizens as well. So there's lots of other examples of this. Sudbury creates a recreational center, Oakville. There's a flurry of these spaces that are constructed, and it's why they're called memorial gardens, because often there was also a garden to accompany it, that, there was a place for quiet reflection, and then this more robust sort of physical commemoration of the war, that by doing we become better citizens, which will protect us from going forward. And the churches were strong supporters of this effort within sort of their own communities as well. So I think we see a lot of things happening, and I've only touched upon a few, that show the way that Christianity and its ideas, whether we're talking about virtues or values, is still very much rooted in Protestant tradition, but it's becoming a lot more diffuse in society. We see it explicitly with religion on the airwaves, sort of traveling out and across the country, but where the message itself has to be tempered or changed. We see it in education, where it becomes a way to instruct people against the evils of communism and to encode in our children an idea about their citizenship. And we see it in the way that we've sort of commemorated other wars. So it's not so much that religion is in decline in this decade-ish. But it certainly did occupy, or did not occupy, the same space in a person's life as it once did. So people had choice now to belong, and some belonged to a church even if they did not believe, because the social function of the institution was crucial to their family life. Some believed but did not want to belong to a church anymore because it didn't quite fit their needs. So maybe they would tune in on the radio instead, and that's how their spiritual needs were met. Protestant values became more diffuse over the decade after the war, and people identified as Christian and insisted upon the values of their Protestant faiths as the bedrock of Canadian society. And this self-identification did not necessarily correlate to packed pews on Sundays. And you get this through call-in programs like where people will come and they will attest that their Christianity is really important. And then they're asked a follow-up question of, well, do you attend church on a regular basis? And they'll say no. So there's a bit of that disconnect between what they're professing to believe and their actions, and it's being normalized that the two don't necessarily have to agree. In 1945, Gwethalyn Graham won the Governor General's Award for fiction for her novel Between Earth and High Heaven. It was a story about Mark and Erica. Mark was a Jew from Northern Ontario, and Erica was a Protestant living in Westmount in Montreal. And the novel explored the tensions of language and religion through the love story of these two people after they met and they fall in love at a party, and then they realize that their backgrounds are at a fundamental disconnect, and they wonder, can they have a life together? Will it work out? Are the barriers of French-English relations and Christian-Jewish relations at this time, are they compatible? And all of this against the backdrop of the Cold War, which seemed to have exacerbated and intensified feelings of anxiety about the future. The foe is now unseen and covert. So I open this chat with the assertion that religion mattered to Canada, in Canada, to Canadians. And I think the title of this book I've just mentioned pretty much sums it up, that Canadians and the churches lived somewhere between earth and high heaven. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was absolutely beyond amazing. You should be on the CBC Ideas program, I think. Definitely. Or write a book for the Massey lectures. I think we'll get going on that.
That's very kind. Thank you.
So let me maybe take you off remove spotlight so we can see everybody evenly, and put me on gallery view. Now, I'm sure people have 1,000 questions. Let's start
This is always
with
the best part.
yes, the fun. Oh yeah, the Q&A. Who wants to now you might want to turn on your camera so we can see your hand up. Now, Peter or Susan, who have your video on, do you have a question yet? Or?
Well, I was just intrigued by, the introduction of radio, the same way that we are, intrigued with the use of the internet with digital streaming and connecting that way. It's like, how can we use this? And I think it's, the best approach to anything. It's like, how can we optimize this for us?
I think what's also interesting, and I think we sort of see this pullback more with internet and Zoom, is that with radio, things become more diffuse. You had to turn the dial. Whereas now with the internet and with more specific podcasts, et cetera, that are out there, it can almost reconcentrate itself again, that you have a pathway to find a more narrowly defined audience that was not necessarily available before. So if we want to just have a podcast, for example, about blue socks, you can do that and you'll probably find an audience. Whereas a radio program in 1945 about blue socks is not going to reach enough people.
Can you take the lead, Susan? I summed at my door.
Sure. There's also, like I follow a number of things. I see there was a photo posted on Facebook back during the 1918 pandemic. Children were getting their lessons over the radio.
Yes.
And so that kind of thing. Yeah, it's interesting that they saw the radio as a way of extending their reach. It's before you had all that, and when things were quieter, then yes, nothing else to do on a Sunday, we go to church. It was also the community center, which is being replaced by coffee shops and social media. Mm-hmm. But it's one thing about Manor Road is that we are trying to act as a community hub for the various groups.
And I think that's sort of one of the ways that that especially in this period that you see it start to change, that as opposed to just a place for spiritual edification, it becomes a place to bring community together. And that can be a lot more broadly defined than it once was. And it can be done without judgment, quote unquote, because different communities and different congregations have different experiences of that. And I think the radio actually helps to sort of bring that. I called them the living room congregants.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can just weigh in. So if you compare, though, when you were talking about the radio at the and pre-World War II and after World War II, it's slightly different, I guess, because we've leaped into Zoom out of necessity. we were a corner. We were corralled into a corner. It was either this or go silent forever. And I'd love to hear your opinion, though. I mean, there's some people who are doing this like we are, and some people are pre-recording. And I would have to say, if we did you pre-recorded and then later on could email, not the same thing.
No, certainly not. I
No,
think
no,
with
no.
Zoom you have a replication.
Yeah.
The intent is to replicate
Yes, yes.
the lived or the shared community experience. But I think the point of difference is that we're not living in sort of the 50s anymore, where sometimes the shared
Right.
experience is sitting around the radio, and later it would have been over the television program, because the number of choices available were just narrower by virtue of sort of the technology.
Mm-hmm. But you remind me of the idea of the shared experience. I mean, I've seen people on Zoom calls. There'll be 4 or 5 people in one window, looking in and trying to share a screen. It's rather comedic,
Yes.
quite honestly. But you bring relevance home. I think of when I think of Leaside as a good example of a community that's repeated itself across the country. And having lived in Northern Ontario in Hearst, I remember they had a cathedral. They also had a 3 orders of nuns, but the arena, the community center, they had, for a town of 6,000, they had 3 ice services and a pool, a very almost Olympic size, and a workout facility. So that became the cathedral.
Very, very much so. That if the place of where you built good citizens was, say, church and school before, it becomes school and community center afterwards. If we're going to focus sort of on well, I guess not quite the baby boom yet. They haven't had their kids, but looking forward to that is like, this is where the youth are going to have to go.
Anyone else? I could keep going.
I was interested that, and I believe it was the radio broadcast, triumvirate did not include the Roman Catholics.
No, they were separate. And so were the Baptists to a certain extent. And this is sort of where the controversy, there was a reason why there was an advisory committee. They did not play nicely with one another. The Catholics had such doctrinal differences from the triumvirate that they had to be kept separate to a certain extent. The Catholics also had a lot more access to more private radio stations, whereas the Protestants had a harder time of taking over or expanding that network into private airplay. Similar to why you have competition from the United States and the evangelicals, because they could just captivate an audience in a way that was not happening on the level of our Protestants.
Okay.
You raised a couple of questions. I mean, the idea of people referring themselves as perhaps Christian and religious but not going to church. But you remind me, have you read the book Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett?
Yes.
So why I refer to that, because there clearly the church wasn't just the religious center, it was the economic and community center.
Yes.
And as we're chatting, it made me think of Manor Road, how and I'm not to pat ourselves in the back. I see ourselves shifting back in that direction to some degree, just because we just sent out word to 2 councillors in the city of Toronto to be a site for vaccination, a free site. So this is an example of church shifting from let's pray and only do that as a church. It sort of goes back to maybe what you were talking about, the center in action.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to that idea that I think the story of the church of the 20th century now into the 21st century is not necessarily one of decline. I think we still often talk about that, but rather of a lot of reimagination. I think there's been a fair bit of struggle as you try to reimagine what you can be, especially if there's conflicts between generations and generational opinions. But I also think it's one of reimagining, of reorientation. And I think that's a much more interesting story to talk about when we're talking about religion in the 20th and 21st century, than it being one of rampant secularization.
Mm-hmm. That's very, 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 very interesting. So when you think of some of the building that did take place, and it was interesting because your story of that person coming from the Soviet Union and referring to the whole almost accelerating the Cold War
Yeah, there's a lot of documentaries about Igor Grushenko, and he defected, and he was known. You'll see like those grainy black and white pictures. He's very easily Googleable, if that's a word, because he would often cover his head with a paper bag because just he wanted to protect his identity. At the time, it came as a shock because he worked at a fairly high level within the Canadian government. And for him to defect really signaled that there was a lot more embedded spies than we had thought there were. And it brought the Soviet threat a lot more, it brought it to Canadian soil. And that freaked a lot of people's beans.
Did that accelerate the Canadian version of McCarthyism?
To a certain extent, although I don't think it was nearly as rampant here. I think we had other fears of otherness in Canada. And I think our historical legacy about that is much more bound up with how we treated our Indigenous groups, with how we treated Jewish immigrants at the time of war and just after. And so I think there was still a fear of communism, but it never came to the point where there were committee meetings to try and call people out. But I think it did double down in terms of how people looked at communism and wanted to support more democratic and like Christian principles here, which is why you have, for example, as I talked about, this Commission on Education, where civilization is now talked about a lot more, and that if we get them young, we're going to be okay going forward. We were still very concerned about the Cold War. Notoriously, up in Aurora, they built a bomb shelter. There's an incredible bunker. There was a great CBC program that detailed how you too could build a fallout shelter, and it tracked one family living in a fallout shelter for a week, just to show that it was going to be okay. And the family emerged after eating, canned goods for a week. So this was I think people were much more afraid of what was going to happen between the US and the Soviets, because that's where the conflict lay, but tangentially we're affected by whatever the US does.
We had an air raid alarm in our neighborhood.
Did you? Yeah.
That every now and then they would do a test.
Yes.
And it was quite large. And at some point you wonder, what would you do anyways? If there was a nuclear bomb, you could just pray to whoever was near you and hope for the best. I mean, that's sort of absurd. That
the cynic in me thinks that at some point, just the feeling that you're a little bit prepared and that you have these warnings as a way to make you feel prepared to face the future, whatever that future might be.
Yeah. So when you think of all the churches that were built in the late 40s and 50s and perhaps 60s, and we use the term real estate now.
Yes.
And there's this almost a accelerated speed to divest ourselves of the real estate and invest in other places. Now, I wanted your opinion. I'm of the opinion, don't close them down and demolish them. Use them as, to your point, community centers or program centers in these various communities. What and I'm not telling you that. Well, what's your thoughts? I mean, you have a person who studied this and what it was doing and where we could go with it. And any thoughts?
I think just because they were built in the 50s doesn't make them lacking in heritage, which is sort of the cap that I wear now. I currently work within a job that assesses the heritage value of properties, and I get to it from the historical perspective. I think one of the challenges is that we talk about them as real estate, and that what you see the architectural details of a place which help to convey the story of its past, but often a place's value could lie in its use, and you can't protect for use. For example, the brickworks. It's not going to make bricks ever again, nor is it, But how do you then convey the story of this place if it was so tied to being works? And I think the city in that case did a really lovely job. They helped to return it to nature. They've put lots of plaques, and the name lives on. So it's taken on a new use, but with a nod to its past life. And that's a really challenging balancing act. How do you convey the history of a place and its value somehow with not just everybody just is like me and stands to read all of the chagrin.
Sorry about that. I'm just going to mute. Okay. There we go. Thank you for your patience with that. Who else has a question?
Yeah.
John Joseph, I don't know if you were on the meeting yesterday. There was an Affirm, United Church Affirm meeting that I was in, and they talked about a church in Ontario.
Yes.
That because I don't remember where, but they had changed. They had shifted their focus to they called themselves the Spire.
Oh.
And the church sign was this beautiful sign that said the Spire, and then underneath was their church name, because they had shifted their focus to becoming more of like a hub, like an events center. And I hear about that more and more now about churches becoming halls for performance. And as a way, this is what you're saying, as a way to keep the church and something that's at the center of a community, but giving it another life, which is something that we are always talking about, which is why we have, daycares and community groups using our space. So I think it's a brilliant way to keep the church so it doesn't become a condo. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No.
There's a tremendous opportunity, and I think people are, I think similar, we're going to come out of COVID and people are actually going to want to go back to the office so they can compartmentalize work and life again a little bit, even though things will change. I think we're looking at a society that is looking for community and doesn't quite know where to get it. Look at the prevalence, for example, in the dating world of eHarmony and online. At one point, you would go to a church event and you would meet others in your community and you would meet people that way. But if we're not doing that, how else are we going? So we have all of these other imagined communities or other platforms by which we try and connect to people. So I think similar to what the Spire and now the Manor can do is you can wear a lot of different hats, and you can respond to a community who is seeking community in whatever way it's constituted.
And I think for us, there's this, I can feel it, this sort of snowball effect where we see ourselves going forward is, we've got this sort of green initiative and we are an affirming church, and now we are looking at becoming an anti-racist church. We are hoping in this very white middle-class neighborhood to become what someone, I don't remember who said it, but they call this rebel church, and I love it. I love the idea of us being this really small community church, but has this this thread that runs through that will take us beyond gathering on Sundays. And I really love that idea. And I love that other churches are also following that same path.
Other questions?
One of the things about the churches in the 50s is that, building codes were a lot different. You're seeing now so many of them having to be, retrofitted with elevators, ramps, the heating. I mean, what we went through just even with the addition that was built in the 50s. So I'm wondering if that's also affecting the history of some of the churches. How much does it cost to maintain them?
A lot, especially if you've got heritage status. And because not just the 50s, something built in the 60s or 70s, that doesn't necessarily comply with the Ontario Building Code of 2021, or the accessibility standards as they're constantly changing, or the sustainability initiatives. And that's not particular to churches. Schools needing to be retrofit, and a lot of buildings. It's a challenge because there's just a greater, I think there's a multiplicity of factors now that we consider, just because our horizons have broadened, right? Our perspective has changed. So it's expensive. But that doesn't necessarily make it not worthwhile. There just probably needs to be more granting institutions and more recognition of the need to provide some help. And I think you can achieve that as you redefine your purpose too.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because there's a lot more grants in Quebec for things like this than there is Ontario. I think of, you're probably familiar with St. James United on St. Catherine Street. And so for those of you who aren't, it's interesting because it was the 30s, I think. They put up a retail front as a temporary measure to raise revenue. And of course, it was longer than a temporary, it was decades and decades. But then the Quebec government came in and did enable them to tear that down and begin to restore the outside as well as the inside. And it's enormous. Massive. Yeah. So when you think of, again, as we are moving forward, and we think of, you probably have seen inside Manor Road, I'm assuming, but maybe you haven't. But what's your opinion of, I mean, I think it's quite exciting that we remove the pews and it creates this wonderful hall-like structure. What's your sense as you think of what churches were, what they are now? And
I like when there's a little bit of flexibility. I think it's interesting as you sort of adapt and you change. When you remove the pews, you also remove the hierarchy that's inherent in the church. And I know that you'll when you can be in person, you'll still sort of stand above to command attention, as any speaker would. But in some ways, it's almost Anabaptist in the way that you're removing the hierarchies that people sitting low and then somebody standing high bring to bear within that community. And I think there's possibility. I think when you embrace change, it's only ever going to reward itself. And I think you can sort of see that tension of embracing change back into the 40s and 50s. It's why there's great ideas out there. It's at this time there's huge movement to bring churches together in the spirit of ecumenism. That we share more in common than we have than we have differences. But that is contingent upon everybody embracing that worldview, and that's a lot harder to make happen. So I think, again, the moment you embrace change, things can happen going forward. And the church is an interesting space. And the moment in the physical space is an interesting expression of that.
what's your opinion of, I think it was, I might get the church wrong. It was Riverdale, is it Riverdale Presbyterian? The one that's on the corner of Pape and Danforth.
Yes.
Are you familiar with it?
No, just the location.
Okay, so what they did, they took the sanctuary and made it condos, and they made the CE wing the church.
Huh.
So it sort of speaks to but instead of demolishing the church, they repurposed a portion of it and kept the shape, the skeleton, and as a wonderful addition to the neighborhood. Are you involved in any projects like that, or?
Yes. So I sit on the Toronto Preservation Board. So we hear a lot about these projects. And as I say, I'm sort of steeped in a lot of the heritage stuff. I think if it's done well, it's done amazingly well. I think and it goes back to my earlier comment that I think at some point the city needs to grow. We need to change. You might as well build and repurpose in the best way. I think sometimes it's to the detriment of the heritage when you just retain the facade. And so it's a lovely edifice, but so what? But it's better than nothing at the same time. So I don't think there's an easy answer because, as I say, you can't preserve for use. So I think right now, the question that I constantly sort of struggle and ponder is how can we do the history of these places better? How can we make it more accessible? So repurposing sort of the place with condos, but preserving the shape and the skeleton is a really wonderful way forward. How can we pay homage to the past better and show the connection with the past in a way that's going to relate to people? Because I don't think we're doing that terribly well yet. And I don't have an answer as to what to do going forward. But that's a historical question more than a use question.
Now, Joanne and Marie, do you have any questions? It sort of came in.
Yeah, no, we're just listening. Oh, sorry, I'm on
Oh,
super
but you're not.
reverb here.
It's like a stadium.
There you go. Okay, that is us. So, love your opinion. So, Belfair United is in the beach, or
Yes.
was, and they joined with Q Beach. Now, if are you familiar with the building?
Very vaguely.
Okay,
As I
so
said, I'm usually better when I have a picture in front of
yeah.
me.
So to your point though, so Belfair United
Yep.
that's on Queen Street now has a liquor store on their as a main store in their main floor, which I'm sure the Methodists or Presbyterian are rolling over in their graves thinking, "Oh my God, we're
Oh
selling hard liquor! Oh my God!"
yeah.
Now I think it's the shoppers on one side and then the liquor, so they're healing on one side and then selling liquor on the other. But right, what a funny. So, yeah, but to your point, I mean, there's an example of something they could have done maybe a wee bit more interesting. But then I think where your mom lived in Caledon, they've turned a lot of older churches into homes.
I think they did do that, and I think
Yes.
they do that in a few other places. I was in the eastern townships of Quebec a year and a bit ago, and the place that I happened to stay was a church that a family had converted into this lovely, home for themselves. So there's so the architecture remains the same. The architecture is consistent. I'm looking at Belfair United right now. That's a really nice job.
Yeah.
As I say, the teetotalers probably not so happy with it, but I think you got to do what you can to preserve the buildings of the past, because what it does is it's more than just sort of the church. It's the landscape of the city as it grows, and so you can see these layers of the city as it's growing up. Rome does this really well, right? Because they just built on top of one another. But as you
Yes.
go down, you have all of these layers of history coexisting, which together tells this really rich story about this long history of a people in a place. Toronto is not nearly as old by any stretch of the imagination, but when you look, say, from the distillery to Cabbagetown to Corktown to Riverdale, is that you do get to piece together this really rich and interesting story of our own history, which is why I've always liked telling the stories of Canada and local histories. We are far more interesting than we give ourselves credit for. We just haven't figured out how to tell our own story very well yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Bethel Baptist Church, right on Millwood, not far from Manor Road, they did an interesting thing. They tore the whole church down.
Yes, I saw
condos.
Yes.
But included downstairs on the main floor, there is a church.
Yes.
Bethel Baptist Church is there.
Yeah.
So they could just stay in the community, but they couldn't keep the church going the way it was.
You have
so
to.
It's an interesting concept. And I think they've done a really good job there too, because the condos are nice. And there's a lovely church and a meeting room, which I think is, a good example of how things can change.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So if you compare and contrast College Street United, are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then St. Andrews United on Bloor Street.
Yeah.
They unfortunately didn't pay any attention to any original architecture whatsoever, and it looks like an office building. But College Street kept a tower and did some interesting things there.
They did, and then there's the one that they're repurposing now on St. Clair and Avenue, which is, I don't think, United Church, but
Deer Park. It was Deer Park United. Yeah,
it was Deer Park United,
Yeah.
not far from Timothy Eaton. There was a few.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that's interesting because there's an example where they've retained sort of the facade, but it'll be interesting to see when it's completely done what that interior and what elements they've decided to replicate for it. But you get to still see there's an example of that streetscape, that view of the city is going to be reminiscent of the past and point to where we're going.
The old Eglinton United Church on Sheldrake, that's all condos. But they did it well, I think, because they kept the facade of the church. And I think the Japanese United Church down on Dover Court, they've made that into condos as well, but kept the front of the building.
Right.
So they're all different. I'd love to live in a church.
I love it. So any other thoughts or questions? Sounds like we'd love to have you come back too. I mean, there's a lot of other areas, especially with your work with the City of Toronto. It'd be quite remarkable.
I will come back and talk history
Yeah.
anytime,
Now,
not just about this.
now what was that
Children are
book?
tired of listening to me talk about it.
Yes.
So,
What was the name of that book you recommended?
The Many Rooms in Our House, I think,
The
by Roberto
Many
Parent. Yeah, I'll look it up and I'll get it right
Rooms
for you.
in Our House. Now, have you written any books?
No, I've just written my dissertation, which is right now I need to propose it to a press.
So you're on the way to be a
I'd
book.
like
Okay.
to. Yeah,
Okay.
and even though my career did not take an academic turn, I would have loved that, but that job market was pretty small. It's been an interesting thing to become more of a public historian and to work from the heritage side of things.
Well, very, very much needed. And so another example, I think, well, there's two. Berkeley United, which is now an event center.
Yes.
And then there's another one. Oh, it might have been Queen Street West United, and it's 763 Queen Street. It was a United Church, still owned by the United Church a couple of years back, but they sold it, and now it's an anthropology shop.
Oh,
on
yes.
On the main floor, yes. In a
Wow.
very gentrified neighborhood, yes, yeah. But
And prior to that, it was occupied by the 761 Community Development Corporation.
that's it. Yes.
And they had a lot of small little
Yeah.
businesses operating out of it. There was a bike repair and I can't remember what else there was there.
Oh, you remind me of two more. The Cabbagetown Boys and Girls Club, that was, I think, might have been a Methodist church. I could be wrong. It's at Spruce and Sumac, and still looks very much like a church. But then the Winchester Street Theater, which I believe was Enoch United or Enoch Presbyterian, at the corner of Winchester and Sackville. Yeah, it's still there. Yeah.
So then you'll like this book. So it's Roberto Parent. It's The Many Rooms of This House,
Right,
Diversity
okay.
of Toronto's Places of Worship. And I really what it underscores is just how many places of worship Toronto had, especially when it wasn't nearly as large as it is now. And the diversity of our places of worship has exploded with the inclusion of so many other communities that now make the fabric of our city.
Mm-hmm. It's remarkable. Yeah.
It really is. It's quite wonderful.
Now, as a person who has a passion for architecture, have you ever encountered the Ganapathy Hindu temple in Regent Park?
No, I have not.
We just did. I'll send you the link to the virtual tour we just did, and think of, they were originally on Parliament, and then they got out of there. They were in Broadview. Then they moved. It was a mechanic's garage, and they've transformed it. It's remarkable. So there's all these wonderful Hindu gods and goddesses and everything else in there. But I'll send it to you because it just reminds you how you can repurpose a secular building into something sacred, sort of going the other way. Yeah.
Going the other way, yeah.
Yeah. I'll send that to you. Well, I would want to see absolutely phenomenal. Oh my gosh, we could. Isn't this amazing, Ayla?
Yeah, I'm just thinking there's another one down where Heinzman used to build pianos.
Yes.
And now it's a Buddhist temple, which is also very interesting.
Where's that?
It's on Heinzman.
Where's
off Queen Street, Queen West somewhere. I can't remember exactly how to get there.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the street is Queen and Heinzman, but it's Queen West. I know that.
Right. Because I know on Yonge Street there was the Heinzman Hall. A friend of mine just told me a story in the 60s about playing there with another friend of his where they made a stainless steel organ and a stainless steel piano. And they played back out there and back. And then, of course, the Heinzmans, they built First Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is on Bond Street. Yeah, a bit of history there. Well, I want to thank you. And Susan, do you want to bid us farewell?
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Doctor, I hope you can come back and talk to us again.
Anytime. This has been a supreme pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been remarkable. Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.